There is a particular kind of suffering that comes not from ignorance, but from knowing too much, not from blindness, but from seeing too clearly. It's the suffering of consciousness turned against itself, awareness that paralyzes rather than liberates. In the 1860s, in a cramped St. Petersburg apartment, Fyodor Dostoevsky created a character who embodied this paradox. The underground man, a former civil servant whose intelligence has become his prison. Nearly 6 years later, halfway across the world in colonial Bengal, the poet Kazi would write Bidruhi, the rebel, a thunderous declaration of defiance that shook the foundations of British rule. These two writers, separated by geography, language, and historical circumstance, were both obsessed with the same question. What do we do when consciousness reveals the unbearable nature of our condition? When thinking clearly means confronting suffering we cannot escape. Dostoevsky's Note from Underground opens with one of the most unsettling declarations in literature. I'm a sick man, I'm a spiteful man, I'm an unattractive man. This is our narrator, the underground man, and he's about to spend the next 100 pages proving that consciousness itself is a disease. Here's what he discovers. The more intelligent you are, the less capable you become of action. Why? Because every impulse gets intercepted by reflection. You want to act, but then you think about acting. And then you think about thinking about acting, and suddenly we're trapped in an infinite regress of self awareness. The underground man calls this hyper consciousness. He watches a simple man, an insulted man who can strike back immediately, instinctively. But the underground man, he analyzes, he considers, he sees all sides. And in seeing all sides, he becomes incapable of taking any side decisively. Listen to how he describes it. I swear to you, gentlemen, that to be too conscious is an illness, a real thoroughgoing illness. The problem is not that consciousness reveals uncomfortable truths, though it does. The problem is that consciousness reveals too many truths, all contradicting each other, all paralyzing action. This is the underground man's tragedy. He knows that 2 plus 2 equals 4, but he resents that 2 plus 2 equals 4. He wants the right to say it equals 5, not because he believes it, but because accepting mathematical certainty means accepting that he's trapped in a world of laws he did not choose, operating according to logic he cannot escape. So, what does he do? Nothing. He withdraws. He retreats into his underground, nursing his spite, perfecting his resentment, analyzing his own inability to act until the analysis itself becomes a kind of perverse action. Dostoevsky is showing us something terrifying here. Consciousness, that supposedly noble human quality, can become a trap. Self awareness can metastasize into self paralysis. The examined life can become the unlived life. But here's the crucial question Dostoevsky poses. Is this paralysis inevitable? Is consciousness always doomed to it itself? Or is there something that the underground man is doing wrong? Some choice he is making that leads him to this dead end. Later in his career, Dostoevsky will create other conscious characters, Raskolnikov, even Karamazov, Alovsha, who also suffer from awareness, but who find different responses to that suffering. Some descend into murder, some into madness, and some maybe into kind of redemptive action. The underground man represents consciousness without ethics, awareness without responsibility. He knows he is hurting others. The scene with Lizzo is excruciating in its cruelty, but his knowledge does not translate into moral action. Instead, it becomes an excuse. I'm too arid to be good. I'm too intelligent to be kind. I see through all moral systems, so I'm exempted from all moral obligations. This is the paralysis we're talking about, not physical inability, but ethical immobility. The underground man has reasoned himself into a position where action itself seems impossible or pointless or contaminated by the very consciousness that contemplates it. And this brings us to our first major insight. Paralysis isn't the absence of consciousness. It's consciousness turned against itself. It's awareness weaponized as an excuse for inaction. When Kazi published Bidruhi in 1922, Bengal was suffocating under British colonial rule. This wasn't the underground of one man's apartment. This was the forced underground of an entire civilization. Colonial rule operates through a particular kind of consciousness manipulation. As Franz Fanon would later articulate, colonialism does not just occupy land, it occupies the mind. It teaches the colonized to see themselves through the colonizer's eyes, to internalize their own supposed inferiority, to become conscious of themselves as less than. This creates its own paralysis. If you accept the colonial narrative, action becomes impossible because how can the inferior challenge the superior? How can the backward resist the progressive? The colonized subject becomes like the underground man, trapped in a consciousness that justifies his own powerlessness. But Nazrul recognized something the underground man never did. The paralysis was imposed, not inevitable. It was a choice that could be unmade. Nazrul himself embodied the contradictions of colonial consciousness. He was educated in both Islamic and Hindu traditions. He served in the British Indian Army during World War One. Despite having no formal education after class 10, he knew six more languages aside Bangla: English, Arabic, Persian, Urdu, Hindi, and Sanskrit. He read widely on literary, cultural, and religious texts across the world. In one of his essays, he pays a short tribute to one of his most favorite poets, Alexander Pushkin, while he even enthusiastically mentions Fyodor Dostoevsky, quoting from chapter 4 of part 4 of uh, Crime and Punishment. I bow down not to thee, but to suffering humanity in you. He wrote poetry in the high literary language while revolutionizing it with colloquialisms and rebellious imagery. In other words, Nazrul was as conscious as the underground man, aware of multiple traditions, multiple truths, multiple contradictions. But he made a fundamentally different choice about what to do with that consciousness. Where the underground man retreated, Nazrul exploded outward. Where Dostoevsky's character used consciousness to justify inaction, Nazrul used it to fuel defiance. The question is, why? What did Nazrul understand that the underground man did not? Vidruhi, the rebel, begins with an image that still has the power to shock. I am the rebel eternal. I raise my head beyond this world. This isn't the underground man's bitter withdrawal. This is an assertion of presence so forceful it threatens to shatter the cosmos. Nojul's speaker does not retreat from consciousness, he weaponizes it. He doesn't analyze himself into paralysis, he declares himself into existence. Listen to this escalation. I am the dance of destruction. I am in the war dance of death. I am the rebel son of the mother. I am the burning volcano in the bosom of the earth. I am the rebel eternal. What's happening here? Nojul is performing what we might call defiant consciousness, awareness that refuses to collapse into itself. Instead of the inward spiral of the underground man, we get an outward explosion that encompasses everything. Hindu gods and Islamic prophets, cosmic forces and human rage, destruction and creation, everything. Here's what's crucial. Nojul's defiance is not mindless. It's not a simple rejection of thought in favor of action. It's something more sophisticated. It's consciousness that has passed through suffering and emerged not paralyzed, but galvanized. Look at how Nojul describes suffering. I am pain eternal. I am torture eternal. He's not denying suffering. He's claiming it. He's making it his own. Where the underground man is tormented by his awareness of suffering, Nojul embraces it as the ground of authentic existence. This is the ethical dimension we have been building toward. For Nujrul, consciousness isn't just about knowing, it's about responding, and the only adequate response to consciousness of injustice is defiance. Think about what colonialism demanded: acceptance, submission, the internalization of the inferiority. The reasonable response was accommodation. The intelligent response was recognizing British power as inevitable. But Nujrul understood something profound. Some truths demand rejection, not acceptance. Some realities must be defied, not accommodated. Consciousness that leads to submission isn't wisdom, it's cowardice dressed in intellectual clothing. This is where Nuzul parts ways decisively with the underground man. Dostoevsky's character says, I'm too conscious to act. Nuzul says, I'm conscious, therefore I must act. The difference is ethical commitment. The underground man has consciousness without responsibility. Nuzul has consciousness as responsibility. The awareness of injustice creates an obligation to resist it. Nuzul made this explicit. He says, I'm a poet. I have been sent to give voice to those who have none. This isn't grandiosity. It's an ethical claim about the purpose of consciousness itself. You don't think clearly in order to withdraw from the world, you think clearly in order to change it. Nazrul's defiance comes at a cost. The poem Bidrohi does not end in triumph, it ends in exhaustion. I shall rest in quiet only when the cries of the oppressed no longer strike the sky. This is defiance without illusions. Nazrul knows this struggle is endless, the suffering is ongoing, but he chooses it anyway. This is what the underground man could never grasp. The action requires accepting suffering, not escaping it. The consciousness demands not paralysis, but courage. The courage to act despite knowing all the reasons not. We have identified our two poles, paralysis and defiance, but what connects them? What determines which direction consciousness will take? The answer for both writers is suffering. But they understand suffering completely differently. For the underground man, suffering is something to be hoarded, protected, and even cherished, but only privately. He suffers exquisitely, self consciously, performatively. His suffering is aesthetic, not ethical. It's something he has, not something that obligates him. He even admits this. I'm certain that man will never renounce real suffering, that is, destruction and chaos. Suffering becomes an end in itself, a way to prove his consciousness, his superiority to the normal people who suffer simply and move on. The underground man's pain does not connect him to the others, it separates him. It makes him spatial, and this spatialness justifies his withdrawal. Neutral suffering is entirely different. It's collective, not individual. When he writes, I'm pain eternal, he's not talking about his pain. He's talking about the pain, the suffering of the colonized, the oppressed, the voiceless. Neutral transforms suffering from private experience into a shared condition, and shared suffering demands shared resistance. Dostoevsky actually knew this. In Crime and Punishment, when Raskolnikov finally confesses, it's to Sonia, a prostitute who suffers but who has maintained her capacity for love and action. It's her suffering with others that redeems his suffering against others. And in the Brothers Karamazov, Father Josima teaches that we are all responsible for everyone. That suffering should create connection, not division. So Dostoevsky diagnosed the disease, consciousness that paralyzes. But he also glimpsed the cure, suffering that connects rather than isolates. Nazrul embodied that cure. His consciousness of suffering didn't make him retreat into an underground. It made him shout from the rooftops. So we arrive at the question of action. Given consciousness, given suffering, what do we do? The underground man says nothing decisive, spite perhaps, cruelty, occasionally, but never committed action toward the genuine good. Neutral says everything necessary. Write poems that could get you arrested. Publish newspapers the colonial government will ban. Compose songs that the workers will sing in the streets. Risk everything for a freedom you might never see. The difference is ethical courage, the willingness to act despite uncertainty, despite awareness of all the reasons for caution, despite knowing you might fail. This is what defiance means, not the absence of consciousness, but consciousness that refuses to be paralyzed by what it knows. Nazrul paid for this choice. He was imprisoned for sedition. His publications were banned. His songs were censored. And in 1942, at the age of 43, he fell silent, struck down by an illness that left him unable to speak or write for the remaining 34 years of his life. The underground man ended in his underground, still talking, still analyzing, still trapped. Nazrul ended in enforced silence, but his words contributed to the echo, to inspire, to catalyze action in others. Which is the greater tragedy, and which is the greater crime? The consciousness is not inherently paralyzing. The underground man's condition is not inevitable. It's a choice, even if it doesn't feel like one. It's what happens when awareness serves the self rather than the world, when intelligence becomes an excuse rather than tool. Second, the suffering can either isolate or connect, depending on how we hold it. Private suffering breeds paralysis, shared suffering creates solidarity and the possibility of action. Third, the defiance is not the opposite of consciousness. It's consciousness fulfilled. It's awareness that accepts responsibility, knowledge that demands response, understanding that transforms into courage. The underground man asks, why act when I can see all the flaws in any action? Nazrul answers, act because you see the flaws. Act because the world is broken and consciousness demands you help repair it. Act because to be aware and to do nothing is the only unforgivable sin. In our own time, when we are bombarded with awareness of climate catastrophe, political dysfunction, social injustice, endless crisis that we can only analyze endlessly but seem unable to solve, we face the same choice. We can retreat into our own undergrounds, starts our knowledge of everything wrong with every proposed solution, or we can choose what Nazrul chose, defiant action despite perfect knowledge of its insufficiency. Ethical commitment despite awareness of all the reasons for cynicism. The courage to act because consciousness demands it. Between paralysis and defiance lies a choice. Dostoevsky showed us one path, Nazrul showed us another. The question is, which underground are we building? The one we hide in or the one we rise from?